Your name. Thank you. Minutes. Society of Antiquaries of London, ordinary meeting Thursday, 16th of December 2021. Christmas miscellany, online only, unfortunately. Professor Martin Millett, President and the Chair. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of Thursday, 9th of December 2021 were read and signed on return and will be read and signed on return to Burlington House. These certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society in order to be suspended in the usual manner. The following miscellany of communications was then laid before the Society. Chancel or private property, reflections on the Fitzalan Chapel case, 1879, by Professor Andrew Spicer, FSA. Assessing an archive assemblage by Dr. Amara Thornton, FSA. And the discovery of a 6th century AD cemetery in the General Secretary's garden by John Lewis, FSA. Thanks for return for these communications. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, 3rd of February 2022, then adjourned the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record?
Pen's run out, but otherwise it's fine. Thank you. There are no certificates and there are no admissions today. So we come to the main business, which is to hear our lecture this evening. And it's being delivered by Dr. Andrew Cormack, fellow, who spent his career at the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon, before retirement as Keeper of Fine Art medals and uniforms. In his spare time, and his own time now, he's a distinguished army historian concentrating on the army of the 18th century. The Army Record Society have published his edition of the Journal of Corporal William Todd, 1745-1762, and he's been the editor of the Journal of the Society of Army Historical Research since 2008. His PhD was published in 2017 on the outpension of the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, which forms the subject of this evening's lecture. A well-recorded people, Chelsea outpensioners in the early 18th century. Welcome, Andrew. Look forward to your paper.
Fellows, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honour to lecture to such a distinguished society, and I'm delighted to be able to do so in person, as well as to welcome those who will attend electronically. You may perhaps forgive the title of this lecture, which slightly teasingly reflects upon the differences between my own research and that of fellows who are archaeologists. How we would all dearly love to know who deposited the Staffordshire hoard, or who owned the villa with the splendid mosaic scenes taken from the Iliad, recently unearthed near Peterborough. Such finds are rich in material culture, but short on personal information. My subject, despite the lowly status of the other ranks of the 18th century army, is rich in personal detail, but poor, almost devoid, of images of identified pensioners. The images that I shall flash up during this lecture are therefore representative pictures of soldiers from the regiments mentioned and are taken from the British Library copy of what is called the 1742 clothing book. We have to do the best we can with what we find. And at the start of this project, I was deeply worried when first visiting the archive of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, to be told, oh yes, we have a note on file in the 1980s. 6 tons of paper disposed, 3 to the Public Record Office, 3 to the incinerator. Fortunately, a lot of the material I wanted went to Kew. This lecture is founded largely on a database containing the records of 25,000 Chelsea outpensioners who appeared before the Royal Hospital's commissioners between 1715 and 1755. It was compiled in furtherance of my PhD studies, and the resulting book is These Meritorious Objects of the Royal Bounty, the Chelsea Outpensioners in the early 18th century. In this talk, I will tell you about the men who became pensioners and will reflect upon aspects of the conditions of service that they signed up to when they became soldiers. Of course, most of them were actually unable to sign their names at all, and in consequence, very few of them left any account as to why they enlisted, what they expected of the army, and what they thought of the experience when it was all over. The records relating to outpensioners, however, offer the best information on other ranks of the 18th century army, because in many cases, they give a range of information that is not available from any other source. These details obviously include the man's name and his regiment or regiments, because some men served in more than one, his age at enlistment, his length of service, his trade before enlistment, if he had one, and where he came from. But they also include the reason for his discharge and sometimes other details about his service. I will reflect upon the effects of military service in an age when medicine was primitive and when rehabilitation after injury or amputation was non-existent. But there are many more questions that arise about the pensioning of ordinary soldiers. Why did government think it necessary to look after old or disabled soldiers at all? And where did this concept spring from? How and why did the outpension arise? And what were the qualifications? Where did the money come from to provide for the upkeep of men who were in the hospital and for the pensions of those who were not accommodated within its walls? And what was wrong with the men? Why were soldiers discharged? How did they get into the condition that meant that they were no longer fit to be active soldiers? What was the procedure for discharge? Recommendation to the hospital, and examination by the hospital's commissioners and its surgeon. How was all that organized? When the man was accepted onto the pension, what happened next? How much were men paid and how were they paid? How did the hospital distribute 3,000 small packets of money throughout the British Isles, including Ireland, when there were no banks, no post offices, and a highwayman on every corner with a large pistol? I exaggerate, but you get the point. And in an age in which fraud, identity theft, and the acquisition of advantage by unfair means was not at all uncommon, how did the hospital attempt to ensure that it was paying legitimate recipients of the pension and that it stopped paying out money when those men died? there's probably enough questions to be going on with. In answer to the first set, the motives for the establishment of the hospital were emulation, learning lessons from recent history, and gratitude, coupled with the desire for reputation and the establishment of legacy. The Royal Hospital was the brainchild of King Charles II, who gave orders for its establishment in 1682. Prior to this, a hospital for soldiers of the British Army serving in Ireland had been founded under the King's name by James Butler, 1st Duke of Ormond, in 1679, and a building had been constructed at Kilmainham on the outskirts of Dublin. It may safely be assumed, however, that these examples of beneficence on the part of the British state took their inspiration from the inauguration of Louis XIV's foundation of the Hôtel Royal des Invalides near Paris in 1674. But it is also not unlikely that His Majesty was drawing on lessons from his own past and from that of his father, which indicated that soldiers who became dissatisfied with the way the government treated them, such as trying to disband them without their arrears of pay, could become extremely disruptive and dangerous. The new model army had shown how unwise it was to attempt such a thing, and had purged Parliament in 1648 and had abolished the monarchy and effectively taken over the government of the country for most of the 1650s. Charles's exile in the Netherlands had also doubtless impressed upon him how miserable a servant of the state, indeed the principal servant of the state, could be if the body from which he expected support and succor provided none of these aids. In addition, the example set by the French king demonstrated what praise and glory might be showered upon a monarch who took such loving care of those subjects who had assisted him to defend, maintain, and transform his kingdom in accordance with the policies that he had chosen. The gilt bronze statue of Charles II that graces the main courtyard of the hospital today radiates exactly the order of splendor, generosity, power, and benevolence that would be attributed to the founder of any such institution. When the hospital first opened its doors in 1692, after a 10-year building program, it could accommodate 472 soldiers. It was not, however, a barracks, as each man was lodged in his own booth, 6 feet square. Most of the life of the inn pensioners would be spent in the common parts of the building, the long wards with the booths arranged down one side, the large dining hall, or the chapel, or in the extensive grounds. The garrison of the hospital, whose residents were organized into companies, were expected to man its guardroom and the sentry posts at its entrances. They also undertook patrolling duties on the road to Knightsbridge in an effort to deter highwaymen. However, even at the very beginning, there were more than 500 additional old soldiers who were entitled to the shelter of the hospital, but who could not be accommodated within it. So from early on in its history, there were those who were sent home to wherever they had originally come from and who received a pension. These men were designated the Outpensioners. It is clear from the admissions registers of the hospital that when examined and accepted for pension, men were not graded at that time as in or out pensioners. And there appears to have been no real difference in terms of severity of disablement or length of service, rank, or any other factor that differentiated the one from the other. All successful candidates were taken on initially as outpensioners, and some of them found their way into the hospital in due course. It is not, however, really known how a man got converted from an outpensioner to an in-pensioner. But it was not permitted for any booth that became vacant by the death of its occupant to be left unused for any considerable length of time. So there must have been a waiting list, presumably of those who lived in or close to London, who had declared that they wished for a place in the house, as it was called. They would be summoned when a vacancy arose. Those who were already married or who hoped to marry in the future had to remain outside because there was no question of accommodation for spouses, let alone children, or they were obliged to abandon their wives. In fact, the outpensioners had existed even while the hospital was being built, because in 1696, King James II had instituted pensions as an interim measure for those former soldiers who would otherwise have had no means of support before they could be allotted a booth. This measure was probably prompted by the discharge of soldiers who had been engaged in the Sedgemoor campaign the year before. The following daily rates of pension were paid according to the branch of service and the rank of the recipient. When the outpension came to be recognized as an indispensable part of the system, payments according to this scale were continued until 1713, just after the War of the Spanish Succession. So infantry privates got 5p, infantry corporals, drummers and artillerymen got 7p, infantry sergeants 11p, privates of horse a shilling, dragoon privates only 6p, dragoon corporals 8p, troopers of the horse guards and corporals of horse 1 and 6p, and master gunners 1 and 2p. Daily, that is. It is interesting to note that artillery personnel were included in this provision because they were excluded sometime before 1712. And the Royal Artillery, which was not established as a regiment until 1716, did not regain its entitlement to the benefit of Chelsea until 1833. So although it's convenient to write of men as having an entitlement to pension, such a right did not, of course, apply to all soldiers discharged from the army. With very little variation throughout the whole of the 18th century, the qualifications that soldiers had to show were that they had been disabled by wounds in fight or other accidents in the service of the Crown, or that they had become unfit after having served 20 years continuously. During the period before the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when a standing army was viewed with great suspicion by Parliament on the grounds that it constituted a threat to the liberties of the people, 20 years continuous service was highly unlikely to apply to more than a very small number of soldiers, because the army was tiny and was reduced to a cadre at the end of each war. However, after the arrival of William III, whose foreign policy tied Great Britain into a pattern of alliances with mainland European powers in the struggle against French hegemony, extended service without a break became much more possible, indeed likely. At the same time, the army increased enormously in size from the handful of regiments that had existed in Charles II's time, and overall the number of men who might qualify for the hospital's provision increased likewise. Although there were reductions, of course, at the end of each war, the number of regiments remaining on the establishment gradually increased, apart from anything else, in order to provide garrisons for newly acquired overseas territories. William III's foreign policy, which set the country on a course of more than a century of regular warfare with France, meant that a hospital of less than 500 beds was never going to be enough, even for a largely volunteer, non-conscript army. Apart from the qualification of having been wounded or having suffered from some accident or illness in the service of the Crown, there was one essential requirement that was never actually clearly stated. This was that the candidate's commanding officer had to certify that the discharged man was entitled to an examination by the hospital's commissioners because he had a faultless disciplinary record. In consequence, there are no identifiable instances among the 25,000 men who were examined between 1715 and 1755 of soldiers who had been punished by flogging. So where did the money come from to pay the outpensioners? Essentially, all soldiers, other ranks and officers, contributed out of their pay to form the fund from which pensions were paid. And in every pay warrant, there was a provision for poundage to be deducted and reserved for this purpose. Additionally, every member of the land forces surrendered 1 full day's pay per year to the fund. Initially, the money was used to pay for the building of the hospital, but from 1686, part of it was dispersed in pensions. And additional funds came from a levy on both the purchase and the sale of officers' commissions. From 1693, the clawback of poundage recovered from the pay of the land forces was fixed, in principle, at £12,000 per annum. This money was only deducted, however, from that part of the land forces that came directly under the War Office, and it did not include any deduction from the pay of the regiments that were on the Irish establishment, which were paid for by the Dublin Exchequer. Soldiering, of course, is and was an inherently dangerous occupation. Wars were relatively frequent during the 18th century, and the efforts of the French, the Spanish, or rebellious Scots always guaranteed that substantial numbers of men were wounded in battle. In the Chelsea records, wounds that had been received many years previously were cited as honourable marks of service by soldiers when they came to examination, and were often the only stated reason for discharge. But it is impossible to tell whether they were continuing to give trouble or not. Thomas Mansfield of Hawley's 33rd Foot had been shot in the left side at Barcelona and wounded in the back by a shell fragment. But that must have happened in Spain before 1712, though his regimental surgeon gave no other reason for him being discharged in 1723. John Collins of the 8th Foot had been shot in the throat at Blenheim in 1704, but he was not pensioned until 19 years later, aged 72. Perhaps his age had something to do with it, but it was not stated as a cause. Some men were pensioned as soon as they recovered sufficiently from their injuries to be examined. 6 months after the Battle of Culloden, April 1746, Edward Wheeler of Dijon's 37th foot was pensioned, having been cut in the head and the shoulder by a Highland broadsword. And only 4 months after Fontenoy, William Sinan of Ligonier's 8th Horse was pensioned, having received 2 pistol balls in his left hand, rendering it completely useless. But combat was by no means the sole course of soldiers reaching the stage where they could no longer serve and had to be discharged. Illness features heavily as a cause in the records. Consequences of serving in the West Indies are well known: yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, dysentery. But very few of these sufferers survived long enough to get back to Britain. But consumption, cancer, asthma, spitting blood, dropsy, palsy, the stone, fever and ague, rheumatism, and lunacy are all cited as reasons for discharge. Illness increased during wartime when men were obliged to live in tents and did not have the benefit of warm public houses. There were, of course, next to no barracks at the time. And of course, there was no police force either. So the army was frequently obliged to maintain public order, suppress rioting, and assist the customs service in preventing smuggling. These duties gave rise to injuries rather than wounds, although the distinction is sometimes difficult to draw. Edward Gore of the 3rd Foot Guards had his eye poked out in a scuffle at the coronation in 1727. Andrew Young of the 32nd Foot was pelted with rocks during a riot in Galway, sufficient to disable his left arm completely. Drummer Jeremiah Orchid of Delorain's 16th Foot, I'm sorry, but I have no picture of a drummer, had his right hand smashed by rioters in 1729. And William Wild of the same regiment had his nose beat almost flat by smugglers in Scotland. Corporal Hudson of Honeywood's Dragoons was disabled in the legs, also by smugglers, by being beaten with oars on the coast of Suffolk. And speaking of cavalrymen, half of all those discharged and pensioned due to injury in 1738 had been hurt by their own or their comrades' horses. And annually, that percentage was rarely less than 20% of cavalrymen pensioned. But injuries also occurred on active service. James Edwards of Powlett's Marines fell out of the rigging on HMS Kingston and badly damaged his back. And Thomas Dedridge of Jeffreys Marines was ruptured by being thrown against a gun carriage on HMS Woolwich. So when a man's captain decided that he was simply incapable of further effective service, he was discharged, and if qualified, recommended for examination for pension. That meant that he had to get to London from wherever the regiment might be stationed: Devon, Norfolk, Lancashire, Scotland, or Minorca. And that meant, of course, that he had to walk, except from Minorca. And he had to wait until the hospital commissioners had their next meeting. Boards were held several times a year. Years of peace, the average was about 10, and in years of war, about 20. And when he arrived in London, the man was quartered in a tavern to wait for the next meeting and was subsisted, and his food paid for by his regiment during that time. Candidates for pension were examined in Whitehall, not at the Royal Hospital out at Chelsea. And initially, that was in the old Horse Guards building, Candaletto's wonderful painting, and later in Killigrew Court off Scotland Yard. They were called in by regimental seniority. Horse Guards, Horse Grenadier Guards, Horse, Dragoons, Foot Guards, Marching Foot, and when they existed, Marine regiments of foot. The men's paperwork was examined, and the hospital surgeon was required to confirm that the man was truly suffering from the condition specified on his discharge certificate. No such certificates have been retained, though their content, or the essential parts of their content, were recorded in the Chelsea examinations registers. In 1732, a parliamentary debate that sought to limit the funds available for pensions and which questioned why so many men were being admitted. In that debate, the Secretary at War defended the scrupulousness of the Commissioner's examinations and declared that we have been so cautious that we have made the fellows stripped to the skin that we might examine them the more narrowly and might be better able to judge whether they were actually disabled. After such a strict inquiry, we could not in conscience, we could not in humanity refuse to admit them. That is not, I would suggest, a sentiment commonly expressed during the 18th century about men of the labouring classes, but it certainly applied to those who were recommended to the Royal Hospital. So, the disabled pensioner, the disabled soldier, has been accepted onto the pension register. What happened next? The standard pension after 1713 for all ranks was 5p a day, £7.12 per annum. But it was paid in arrears and supposedly every 6 months. In fact, this was rarely true, and the Treasury supplied the hospital with money when it was able to do so. In addition, 12 months' money was often made available in one delivery rather than 2 half-yearly payments, which therefore built in a considerable delay to the first notional payment period. And up to 1732, money was often late in arriving. After that date, it was somewhat more regular. It is highly likely, however, that discharged soldiers had highly unlikely that discharged soldiers had any money of their own to keep them going in the period between their examination and acceptance onto the pension and their arrival back at their home village. Soldiers who had originated from London or the home counties might have been able to get friends, relatives, or family within a short, 2 friends, relatives, or family within a short time. Those who lived within 20 miles of London were supposed, in any case, to come in and collect their pension money in person when it was issued. But men recruited in Yorkshire, Somerset, or Ireland would have had no means of undertaking their homeward journeys unless they could acquire some cash. This was a fundamental flaw of the system, but it was not changed until the middle of the 18th century. The solution was that men sold the right to their outpension to people called dealers, money lenders, who supplied cash at a discounted rate against the future delivery of the pension. cut that they took was variously reported and seems to have ranged between £1 and 12 shillings and £1 and 6 shillings. So the pensioner received either £6 or 6 guineas. In order to hedge their bets, dealers are highly likely to have paid only 6 months' worth of money at any one time. The new pensioner was, of course, required to put his name or his cross on an affidavit signing over his pension rights to the dealer, who then collected the full amount of the pension from the hospital when it announced a paying out day. This initial receipt of cash allowed the pensioner to get back home, but what happened thereafter? And how did he receive subsequent payments? The difficulty of transporting money about the country and the profusion of commercial transactions that were required to ensure that agricultural produce reached the towns and cities, and that luxury imported and manufactured goods were dispersed into the counties, meant that very sophisticated credit arrangements were commonplace. As far as the out pension is concerned, this involved dealers making arrangements with shopkeepers in provincial towns to pay the pensioners who lived in their locality in exchange for the shopkeeper having access to credit in London. So the grocer in Wrexham, Carlisle, Lincoln, or Chichester, who wished to supply his customers with legitimate, as opposed to smuggled, tea, tobacco, wine, chocolate, or sugar, had to buy these commodities in London. The draper, who wanted to sell Indian cottons or French silks, also had to get those products through London. In return, therefore, for a source of credit in the capital provided by the dealer, who paid the grocer's tea bill to the East India Company, the grocer paid the dealer's client, the out pensioner, who resided in North Wales, Cumberland, Lincolnshire, or Sussex. That was how the system worked and how the hospital avoided the bother of having to transport money around the country. Men, as we've heard, men who lived within 20 miles of London were supposed to walk into the hospital when a paying out day was announced in the London Gazette. But that depended upon their being able to tide themselves over for the initial period of at least 6 months until their money became available. And that was certainly not realistic for some. Sergeant Roland Owen of Cadogan's Fourth Foot, who lived in the parish of St. James's Piccadilly, across the road, was obliged to sign up with the dealer Daniel Wedge of St. Martin in the Fields in 1732, because he was unable to wait for his money. Thomas Temple, a private gentleman of the 2nd Troop of Horse Guards, pensioned aged 70 in 1722, signed up with John Wilkinson, a cloth worker of Whitechapel, who was doubling up as a dealer in 1737, probably because at the age of 85, he could no longer walk out to Chelsea. Naturally, the hospital was well aware that there were problems or opportunities inherent in a system of paying government money to thousands of individuals who, once their uniforms had fallen apart, were indistinguishable from civilians, and they were scattered all over the country. Initially, it instituted a procedure under which out pensioners were obliged to make their way to Chelsea for a general examination. Pensioners of every regiment were called in on particular days to exhibit the certificates that they had been given when accepted onto the books. and it was anticipated that they would linger at their own expense in London or the villages around Chelsea until the authorities had checked them all. Only then could those who had not appeared be omitted from the pay list under the presumption that they had died. This was clearly not a practical procedure because of the time and expense involved, difficulties of communication, and not least, the gross inconvenience to old and often disabled men who had to walk in from Devon or Yorkshire to prove that they were still alive and entitled to their money. From 1719, the system was refined so that outpensioners were required to attend their local magistrate to make oath that they were the persons specified on the pension certificate which they exhibited, and to prove by their attendance that they were still alive. They were obliged to do this twice a year, and the Justice of the Peace, without fee, was obliged to send an affidavit to the War Office confirming that the procedure had happened, thereby qualifying the man for inclusion on the next pension list. The hospital then drew down the correctly calculated sum from the Treasury when it was available, and the payment was made either in person or to the man's dealer. More than 6,000 of these magistrates' affidavits were therefore produced every year, but neither the Royal Hospital nor the National Archives have any examples of the documents that were linchpins of the system. But the Gloucester Record Office has. Here is the certificate that was given to the man in not terribly good condition, but nevertheless, when he was examined by the hospital and put on the pension list. And there is the affidavit sworn before Will Barnes, a magistrate. Thomas Brown came this day before me, one of His Majesty's Justices of the Peace, for the city and county of Bristol, and made oath that he is an outpensioner of Chelsea College, last belonging to Colonel James Otterways, being the 9th Marching Regiment of Foot, aged about 70 years and a half, served 15 years, disabled by a fall on his duty in the left thigh near the castle of St. Philip's in the island of Minorca, and that he is no otherwise provided for by government. His place of abode is in the parish of St. Philip's in the city and county aforesaid. Sworn before me this 25th day of June and signed by Thomas Brown, who was clearly at least literate enough to sign, and by Will Barnes, the magistrate. Not quite as wonderful as the Staffordshire hoard, but to me, just as interesting. The individual concerned, Thomas Brown, had been recruited aged 17 in 1705 and had been crippled in an accident in one of the mine tunnels within the fortress of St. Philip's on Minorca. He was sent back to England, examined by the hospital commissioners, and placed on the outpension on the 21st of July, 1720. The fact that he was claiming pension 35 years later emphasizes the long-term commitment by government to the welfare of soldiers that the pension represented. But what of the men whose service had left them completely unable to fend for themselves? Robert Williams, Braggsfoot, aged only 17, was never going to make shoes again after losing his left arm at Ostend in 1744. Sergeant Isaac Blackburn of Reed's 9th Foot, was not able to go back to wood turning in Yorkshire because he was blind after 52 years' service. Jeremiah Kearsley of Cornwall's 7th Marines was unlikely to take up weaving again, as both his eyes had been damaged in a gunpowder accident. And James Gilray, the father of the artist of the same name, never took up blacksmithing again after he lost his right arm at Fontenoy in Rich's Dragoons. If possible, these men found some other occupation to support themselves, or they depended on the poor law to supplement their pension. But the receipt of a Chelsea pension did not disbar them from parish relief. It was recognized from the 1740s onwards, the system of dealing, selling pensions for a discounted return, was unfair and contrary to the spirit of the royal charity that the Chelsea Hospital represented. As we have seen, outpensioners lost between 17 and 22% of their money by the dealer's cut. But it had to wait until 1754 before the system was reformed. In that year, the Paymaster General, William Pitt, introduced an Act of Parliament that abolished the practice of dealing as from the 25th of December 1754 for men taken on to the pension thereafter, and for those already on it, arrangements with dealers were to cease as from the 25th of December 1755. After those dates, the pension was to be paid in advance and by government officials rather than private entrepreneurs. In fact, the duty was handed over to the collectors of excise, who took in the excise tax on commodities such as beer, paper, soap, and candles manufactured within the country, and who therefore had government money immediately available with which to pay the pensioners in the counties. This was the system that persisted for the rest of the century at least, because there were effectively no other civil servants in the countryside to take on the task. When the collectors remitted the money they had collected to the excise office, they noted how much they had dispersed to the outpensioners, and the excise office reclaimed that sum from the agent to the outpensioners at the hospital. Pitt's Act of Parliament that reformed the method of paying the outpension referred to the recipients as these meritorious objects of the royal bounty, and the descriptions of their service, the hardships they went through, and the wounds, injuries, and ailments that they suffered amply prove that they were indeed deserving of the state's care and support. None more so than the only named outpensioner of the early 18th century, of whom we have a portrait. Thomas Brown, not the same man as who had the certificate in Bristol, served in Bland's 3rd Dragoons. At the Battle of Dettingen, the French cavalry seized his regimental guidon, the regimental flag, and in recovering it, which he did successfully, Brown received 8 sword cuts to the head and neck, one of which almost severed his nose from his face. 3 pistol balls passed through his hat, but 2 others lodged in his back, and 2 fingers were cut from his left hand. Brown is an extreme case, but of such stuff were the men made who received the royal bounty of Chelsea Hospital. They were meritorious indeed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really fascinating insight. For me, as someone who's not a military historian, I had no idea of the richness of this resource for sort of understanding not only the military, but also insights into the social history of the 18th century. It's really, really fascinating. Can I take sort of chair's privilege by opening the question myself?
Of course.
And asking whether work has been done on the geography of where the pensioners were living, because as someone interested in the sort of spatial dynamics of history, this sounds to me like a really, really rich source.
Yes, many of the examination records, certainly after the late 1720s, say where the man originally came from. Whether he went back there after he had been pensioned, that we're not quite sure about. But I have plotted which counties, the old counties, of course, the men came from, including Scotland and in bulk, Wales and Ireland.
Yeah.
That is one of the appendices in the book. But yes, they were recruited from all over the place. And the idea that regiments had particular recruiting areas simply doesn't apply in the 18th century. So Scots Greys, 2nd Dragoons, famous Scottish cavalry regiment, could be recruited in Worcestershire. There's no logic to it. They came from all over.
That's fascinating. Really. Can I ask anyone in the room or who's listening online to come in with questions now? We'll take questions in the room first. Right? Has someone got a mic to pick them up?
Well, thank you for the lecture. And I know that you didn't actually mention the fact that these outpensioners continued to have a military service liability. I wonder if you could say a bit about that in terms of the invalid companies.
Being a study of the 18th century, it is not at all surprising that the War Office wanted to squeeze the last drop of military service out of the chaps. And even though they were pensioned, they could be recalled to service in what were known as the invalid companies. And there was one invalid regiment based at Portsmouth in order to do garrison duty. So they did not have to do a great deal of marching, but they served, essentially, they served the guns of the fortress in wherever they were stationed, because there were barracks in those fortresses. And there's a whole string of fortifications, Sheerness, Tilbury, Landguard Fort, Hull, Tynemouth, Carlisle, Chester, Scilly Isles, Channel Islands, Pendennis, St. Maur's Castle, and Plymouth, mostly round the coast, and they were all manned by invalid companies. As long as the man was capable of propping his musket against a wall, he was deemed to be sufficiently fit for service. If I do volume 2, then I will examine the invalid companies. But they're fascinating. And most of those garrisons, of course, those fortifications, are now looked after by English Heritage. So they ought to know what was going on in their properties.
There was mention of funding from Dublin. Was there a distinct situation for pensioners in Scotland and Ireland, I'm guessing this person means?
Because the military establishment of Ireland was entirely separate from the rest of Great Britain and was paid for by the Dublin Exchequer, the funding for Kilmainham Hospital came from the Irish Parliament, the Irish Exchequer. Kilmainham did not work on the same terms as Chelsea. Chelsea would accept men from all regiments serving in Great Britain and in the colonies, America, Minorca, Gibraltar, West Indies. But Kilmainham would only accept pensioners from or discharged soldiers from British Army regiments if that regiment had served 7 years continuously in Ireland. That's an oddity. Unfortunately, many of the papers about the army in Ireland were destroyed in the Four Courts fire, but it is possible to work out to a significant degree what was going on in Kilmainham, but it was not at all the same system as applied to Chelsea.
If an outpensioner emigrated, for example, to Canada, were they able to continue receiving their pension or did they relinquish it?
The difficulty of delivering money to anyone overseas was such that they could not receive it on a regular basis. If they actually emigrated to Canada, and I don't think there was a great deal of emigration in the 18th century in Canada, except from soldiers that had campaigned in Canada and that were discharged in Canada, normally with a land grant. And so they were essentially given land upon which they could farm and they could remain there. The land grant replaced any pension that they might have received from Chelsea. There are instances, however, of, despite the fact that men had clearly been ill or wounded or injured or whatever, but there are a few instances of men who were fit enough to take service with the East India Company, not in their military forces, but on their sailing ships, and who are noted down as not being able to send in the certificate for 2 years because he was in the East Indies. And the man, when he returned to Great Britain, could apply and was put back onto the pension register. He may have lost money in the intervening time, but he could take up his pension again. But for those who emigrated, the answer, I think, is no, certainly not in the 18th century.
Andrew, thank you for a fascinating talk. How did naval pensioners compare to army pensioners in the early part of the 18th century?
Well, the Navy had Greenwich Hospital, and that was funded at least partially by what was known as the Chatham Chest, into which all sailors, Merchant Navy and Royal Navy, contributed. I dare say that it was also topped up with money from the government. But sailors were much less happy being, as it were, cooped up in a large building. And in fact, the Royal Hospital at Greenwich ceased to hold naval pensioners in, I think it's somewhere in the 1860s. And although the buildings, of course, are still there, the naval pension arrangements were dealt with in another way. But I must admit that I have not done a great deal of work on naval pensioners. The Chelsea lot took me 10 years. So
Did the pension cease on the death of the pensioner, or could it be paid to their widow?
the pension definitely ceased on the death of the pensioner. There was no provision whatever for spouses or children at this period. And the magistrates to whom the pensioners went to have an affidavit made out so that they could be put on the pension list by the War Office, the magistrates were told that they should, if at all possible, list those men whom they expected to turn up and say, I'm Private Smith from the 16th Foot and I'm still here, so please put me on the list. But if that man did not turn up, then the magistrates were supposed to compile lists of their regulars who didn't actually appear. And it was presumed at that stage that they had died. There are also instructions to all of the outpensioners to report the death of any of their comrades whom they may have heard about. People, soldiers who lived in the same locality and whose death had become known in the village, and therefore they should have reported those. There are the 6 tons of paper that Chelsea disposed of, fortunately, an awful lot of it to the Public Record Office, but the 3 tons that went to the incinerator, goodness gracious, must have contained a lot of affidavits, but also complete sets of in-letters from the pensioners to the hospital, written by the local parson, because most of them wouldn't be able to write, but or the overseer of the local squire's estate, letters that queried what was going on. Why hasn't my pension been paid? But no, there was no provision for children or for spouses.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I wondered if this was a bespoke system for England or whether it was based on Les Invalides in any way.
I have not examined the administration of other invalid establishments, either in France or anywhere else. I hope that this study will prompt people to say, oh, well, that's what the British did. What did the French do, or the Prussians, or the Austrians, or whoever it is? There were hospitals in the capitals and principal cities of Europe, but exactly how they administered their particular pension scheme, I'm afraid I don't know.
Thank you very much for that wonderful explanation of the early 18th century. I wonder whether the story has been continued and the research for the later 18th and on into the 19th. I have an answer myself. You and I have been in touch about him, who was fighting throughout the Peninsular War, and he became an outpatient in Wales and in Gloucester. And I just wonder to what extent we can find out about those people who belong to the early 19th century.
Well, the examinations registers are still available at the National Archives. So you will be able to find the man's name. The payment system did change to some degree. There are Army General Orders in, I think it's about 1806, which introduced a much more finely graded payment system. To some degree, that was because the troops who had gone to Egypt to fight Napoleon in 1801 suffered terribly from ophthalmia. So there were an awful lot of blind former soldiers. But a graded system, according to what parts of your limbs you may have lost, or your sight, or whatever, that was introduced in the early 19th century. So far as I'm aware, the payment by the excise collectors continued into the 1830s. And it's only when we get a post office in the form that we recognize it now, that duty was taken away from the excise collectors and handed over to the post office, who indeed still pay old age pensions for those who don't have bank accounts. But I have not done a great deal of work on the later administrative systems of the Chelsea pension, and really nobody else has either, I'm afraid. (1880) Well, yes, it is. It's extraordinary how long disabled soldiers continued to live. There is I'll paraphrase it, but there is a quote in a parliamentary paper, I think from about 1730, saying, it is quite extraordinary that once disabled soldiers get put onto the outpension, they become immortal and go on forever. Some did. Some, Thomas Brown, the dragoon, those wounds that you see on the print, they would not heal. He drank himself to death within about 3 years. But there were others who continued to collect their pension for a very long time. And that does emphasize the fact that the government essentially was prepared to sustain that burden over extremely long periods. Well, yes, some of them did get married, and even pensioners who served in the invalid companies in, for instance, the Scilly Isles, despite their injuries and despite their age, they were seized upon by the local women because they wouldn't have thought about it in that way, but they were introducing a new gene pool to the breeding population. That's more of that in volume 2.
Andrew, thank you. Fascinating talk and some really interesting discussion on the question. So can we express our thanks again to Andrew? I give notice the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 10th of February 2022, 5 p.m. when we will hear a report on the Maritime Archaeological Survey of the Tiber, Italy by Dr. Peter Campbell. Meeting stands adjourned.